Welcome to the American Institute of Healthcare Professionals Videogram on Christian counseling on the topic of just war theory. And this is an interesting topic because of the recent war in Europe that's erupted. And it also plays at the central core of being a Christian in a fallen world. How can we be Christian and at the same time advocate war itself? So the term just war in itself is in many ways a contradiction. How can Christianity coexist with war itself? So a fallen world presents many challenges to peace. And of course, force and violence in itself can be something very destructive and very sinful. But when force and violence in a fallen world is used to restore peace, to defend others or yourself, it is something that is extremely important and something that only exists in a world that is fallen, where you have to go to an extreme to preserve something that is good, that is the status of peace itself. But throughout Scripture, do we not hear Christ say to turn the other cheek, or that those who use the sword or pick up the sword will die by the sword itself? So there seems to be a message of Christ. Is it of pacifism? And I think we need to look at those quotes more so with personal life and revenge versus social evil and justice itself. In our personal life, yes, we should turn the other cheek, as long as they're not trying to literally kill us, and self-defense is necessary. But when it comes to insults, when it comes to individuals who are misbehaving in bad ways, it's up to us to show Christian humility, to show Christian compassion. And we're definitely not to go out to pick up the sword in a spirit of revenge because someone has wronged us. So when social evil happens more on a grand scale and justice needs to be fulfilled to restore the evil, to defeat the evil and to restore peace, then there are a series of ideas that exist where the oxymoron statement, just war, is very applicable even within Christian theology itself. As they say, evil exists when good men do nothing. And this was erroneously attributed to Edmund Burke, but it was really in a presentation by John Stuart Mills, the founder of utilitarianism. And the idea is when good men do nothing, evil prevails and justice is never met. And instead, bad things occur. And we see this happening throughout history, obviously in World War II, but most recently, we see it in Ukraine itself. Thou shalt not murder versus thou shalt not kill. And many scholars say that the actual commandment is thou shalt not murder. So when we're going into an idea of just war, is killing always forbidden? And sometimes the taking of a life in a fallen world might be a byproduct of a necessary action. So individuals who are trying to protect themselves from a theft, an assault, might have to use force or violence to protect themselves. And the evil end, the intention might not be to kill, but to preserve one's life themselves. And this brings us to the idea of self-defense and the principle of the double effect. And that's a principle found in moral theology. It's in another video that I did. And the double effect means that there's an act, at least good in intention, neutral, that produces two simultaneous effects, one good and one not intended, a byproduct. It might even be considered negative. And in terms of defending yourself against a thief or an assaultant, they attack you, you do the force that's necessary to preserve your life, and the byproduct is you save yourself, but the assaultant is injured or dies. So this is permissible morally, even though the action results in someone dying, because the intent isn't to kill, the intent is to preserve life. And the byproduct of you preserving your life is not a means to an end, but is a simultaneous effect that occurs in itself. So when we look at just war at a more grand scale, at a larger scale, a macro scale, it's a lot more than just you yourself defending oneself, but it is nations upon nations defending themselves against tyrannical evil at a much larger scale, where more injustice can occur and more evil and suffering from the banner of Satan against the banner of Christ, which is peace itself. But even within war, there's another type of oxymoron, a more civilized, quote unquote, type of war individuals have looked at. In modern society and within the Geneva Convention, there's been ideas of how to civilize war. It sets a standard for certain behaviors between nations that are expected to be adhered and obeyed. So when individuals and nations enter into war with each other, there should be expectations, or at least attempted expectations. And among those is the treatment of civilians and any non-military targets. Civilians can't be targeted. Schools, hospitals, they cannot be targeted. A treatment on how POWs, prisoners of wars, are received. Prisoners of war are taken in. How are they treated? They're not to be tortured. They're not to be beaten. They're to be given the basic substance of food and water and shelter that human dignity demands itself. And there's also a banning of certain types of weapons and chemical bioagents that cause intense pain and immense destruction at a grand scale. And these types of weapons among civilized nations has been said have been banned, and the nations in their various conferences and meetings have signed treaties condemning the use of various weapons that cause this type of huge amount of human fatalities and deaths at a very grand scale. So these things are condemned. And when these actions against civilians or use of bad weapons that cause mass destruction or prisoners are mistreated, these are considered war crimes. And they are sent to face society once their nation is defeated. Hitler opted out. Stalin died within his own confines. But today we see Putin committing numerous war crimes in Ukraine. And he's going to have to answer for it some way or another. And if he is defeated or if he is handed over, he will face a tribunal. He will face justice at the hands of the world that demand a certain behavior during war itself. St. Thomas Aquinas covered a lot of ideas on how Christians are to behave in war, and it brought about a lot of his just war theory. And he laid out certain principles with jus ad bellum and how we are to behave as Christians and as Christian nations during war. And here's 6 of the more common important things that he laid out that need to be followed for a Christian in good conscience to fight in a war itself. First, the cause needs to be just. So it's a nation that is defending its borders, that is defending itself from an aggressor, or helping another nation that is being unjustly assaulted upon. So there is a defense against the aggressor. It's not a war in which one invades. Second, the authority must be legitimate to declare a war. You can't just have a ban of individuals who decide to commit violence itself. Third, the war must be a last resort. All forms of diplomacy must be exhausted. Number 4, the intention itself must be to restore peace. Number 5, the proportionality of the violence against the aggressor must be within what is required. So we're looking at justice here, not vengeance. So we do not attack a smaller nation that was an aggressor, and after defeating it, literally lay it to waste. There's a proportionality, and sometimes ideas of proportionality are also weighed in with many gray areas, such as the thought of, should the atomic bomb be used on Hiroshima or Nagasaki? Was the proportionality just? And many say no, others say yes, because they were looking at the preservation of American lives against an aggressive nation. But at the same time, it was fired upon cities for a greater good, maybe. It's hard to say, because war, even if you are among the just defending, you can fall into these situations that are very morally cloudy. And the outcome of the war, if you're going to enter into it, there has to be at least some logical outcome that can be somewhat plausible to be completed, not just to enter a war, to enter into a war itself. During the war, again, we saw with the Geneva Convention, certain behaviors that are mandatory, but it is also the same with St. Thomas Aquinas, how women and children and other non-combatants are treated, the humane treatment of prisoners, accepting prisoners with dignity, no torture or execution of unarmed soldiers, no use of excessive weaponry that outweighs the good that can result in actually using them, and the banning of any type of inhuman weapons, such as chemical weapons and other things that are cruel and unusual. And these are all basic rules of war, and how as Christians we're to treat even the aggressor with some type of mercy and compassion once we're able to control them, where they're no longer a threat to someone else. Ultimately, war is hell. It is in many ways a product of our own punishment that we instill upon ourselves through sin itself. We hear about the 4 riders of the apocalypse. One of them is war itself. So even when filled, even when on the side of good, atrocities can be committed by both sides. And this is a very unfortunate thing. But wars filled with hate, vengeance, greed, jealousy, and lack of respect of life. So any side can find itself on the immoral action from time to time. Of course, we've seen it more so with dictators such as Hitler and Stalin and other dictators in China, Mao Zedong, and today Putin, and how Vladimir Putin has attacked innocent civilians in Ukraine and is basically committing a genocide against those people in itself. But war is a price of sin. So we have to offer prayer, penance, and reparation, for God is very offended. There is a Catholic apparition, or Lady of Fatima, who emphasized to the visionaries that God is already greatly offended from the sins of the 20th century. And there must be reparation made. We must offer our crosses to Christ, to offer to the Father, for Christ is our high priest. And if not, there will be a chastisement. And Russia will continue to spread her errors throughout the world. And these were the words of Our Lady of Fatima in 1917. So these are things to consider, just for the very fact that we live in a fallen world. War is a product of sin. And how can we ourselves, maybe many of us are unable to defend others as a good soldier. Well, we can defend them with our own weapons of scripture, of prayer. Those are spiritual weapons. And offering things up, offering reparation to an offended God already for those who refuse to apologize for the great blasphemies they commit against God himself. So I'd like everyone to remember, please continue to pray for Ukraine, for peace in Ukraine, but also for the conversion of Russia. There are many Russians under the same iron fist of Vladimir Putin. And we must continue to pray. We must continue to also support how you can through giving to various agencies the life-needing health supplies through monetary funds or through things you might have yourself to send, or to also send religious items. Anything that you can do to help the people of Ukraine against this unjust war. As we see, Putin fails every single criteria, just like Hitler before him, just like Stalin before him. So here's our Christian counseling certification, the link below. It's an online program. You can go at your own speed, your own pace. Our phone number is 330-652-7776, and our email is info@aihcp.org. Again, pray for peace, pray for Ukraine, pray for the world. Thank you for listening, and have a good day.